Chapter 8. The Second Week. Seeing is Believing. I waited in stunned silence while I heard sirens down the street. I told the 911 operator that the paramedics had arrived. "All right, ma'am. Please wait for the police. They'll be there shortly to take your statement." My statement? I opened the door for the paramedics. They tried to resuscitate Michelle. They couldn't. Soon the police arrived, headed by Inspector McNerney, the same cop who'd helped me with Jim's car the day before. He came into the house and barely looked at Michelle. Instead, he looked straight at me, cocking his head to the side. "Well, well, well. Who do we have here? Mrs. Connelly, is it?" He jetted his chin at me a bit, challenging me. "Kind of a surprise to find you here. How's your car? File that insurance claim yet?" What was he accusing me of? Insurance fraud? Something worse? "No, I didn't. Not yet." I could feel his gaze. I supposed he was waiting for an explanation. "I came over to see my friend Michelle." McNerney nodded at me. "This is my partner, Jones. This is Miss Connolly." Jones was younger than McNerney, with kind eyes and short dark hair that was gelled back. He smiled sympathetically at me. McNerney gestured toward the wine glasses. "Did you have wine with her?" No, I just got here. She didn't answer the door. I tried her phone and left a message. I saw her through the window, on the floor. The door was open. I thought maybe she passed out." Inspector McNerney squinted at me, then pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. "You looked through the window? What window?" I pointed to the dining room stained glass window. McNerney walked into the dining room and peeked out. "It's high." "I know. I had to move the planter box and climb up." McNerney scratched his chin, still looking out the window. "You moved it?" I nodded. Jones looked around the living room. "How did you gain access into the house?" "The front door was open," I repeated. "I don't get it. Why look through the windows?" Jones asked. "Well, I rang the bell. She didn't answer. I didn't think to try the door. Who leaves their door unlocked in San Francisco? So I wanted to peek through a window." "Why?" McNerney countered. "Why didn't you just leave? Maybe she wasn't home." "But she was home, sort of." "Do you normally climb planter boxes to look through people's windows when they don't answer the door?" McNerney asked. "No, I just... her husband..." "Was murdered, yes." McNerney nodded. "I was worried about her." "Why?" Jones asked. I shrugged uselessly. "The last time I saw her, she told me she was scared." "Scared of what?" McNerney scowled. I stared at him. "Scared that whoever killed her husband would come after her." "Ah," McNerney said, tapping his pencil on his notebook. "And did she tell you who that was?" I took a deep breath. "No." A uniformed officer bent over Michelle, measuring something. I averted my eyes, pressing on them to keep from crying. McNerney walked over to Michelle's body and studied her for a moment. "You found her like this?" "Yeah. No, I mean, she was face down. I turned her over." "Can you tell us what you've touched?" Jones asked. "The phone, the door, Michelle." I spun around, taking inventory of the room. "I think that's it." "What happened to your pants?" McNerney asked. I felt the back of my pants. They were torn around my hamstring. "I tore them when I fell off the planter," I said, rubbing at the bruise I was sure was forming on the backside of my leg. McNerney grunted, making no effort to conceal his skepticism. He scribbled something into his notebook, then indicated a pair of prescription glasses on the coffee table. "What about those glasses over there? Are they yours?" "No." "Are they Michelle's?" Jones asked. My stomach churned. I don't know." McNerney made a note, then looked up at me. "I thought she was your friend." "She was my friend. I just haven't seen her in a long time. I don't know if she wore glasses." The front door squeaked open and Nick Dowling, the medical examiner, poked his head through. "Got a call." His eyes landed on Michelle. "I see I'm in the right place," he said, nodding at McNerney and Jones. McNerney and Jones nodded back. I tried my best to look inconspicuous. Dowling spotted me. "Mrs. Connolly! Didn't think I'd see you so soon." McNerney and Jones' heads spun toward me so fast I was afraid they'd break their necks. I smiled despite gritted teeth and raised an eyebrow in acknowledgement to Dowling. McNerney, Jones, and Dowling all exchanged glances. Then McNerney barked, "Downtown!" Jones crossed to me while McNerney and Dowling huddled over Michelle. "Mrs. Connelly, I know how upsetting all this can be," Jones said, "finding your friend and all. Maybe it's best if you came downtown with me to the station. We'll be more comfortable, and I'll be able to take your official statement." I froze. "Downtown? I have a newborn," I stuttered. "I have to get home and feed her." Suddenly I felt nauseated. What had I gotten myself into? Jones was expertly maneuvering me towards the front door. "A newborn? Really? I got a 9-month-old. Aren't they great?" McNerney instructed another officer to start dusting for prints. Jones pulled open the front door. The fresh air relieved my nausea a bit. We walked in silence down the front steps. Once on the curb, Jones gestured to a parked car nearby. "This your car?" I shook my head and pointed to my Chevy Cavalier parked down the street. "You want to follow me downtown?" he asked. "Or you want to ride with me?" "I can drive myself." "Sure, no problem. You're going voluntarily, right?" Was I? From the relative safety of my car, which I was happy to see had not been broken into again, I dialed home and instructed Mom to give Laurie a formula bottle. The only good thing about my initially being rated poor at breastfeeding in the hospital was that upon hearing this, Mom had immediately run out and bought formula. When I caught her smuggling it into my pantry, she had mumbled, "Just in case," which I took to mean, just in case you're too lame to get the hang of what every mother has been doing naturally since the beginning of time. Outwardly, I was a little offended. Inwardly, I was relieved. Just in case I was too lame, there was no reason for Laurie to starve. Besides, you never know when you're going to stumble across a dead friend and need your mom to feed the baby. At the station, I was escorted by Jones to a small room with a mirror, a table, and a few chairs. On the table was a box of tissues, a couple of notepads, and a small recorder. Jones sat across from me and hooked a microphone into the recorder. "Do I need a lawyer?" I asked nervously. Jones smiled. "For what?" I shrugged. "Mrs. Connolly, you're not under arrest. I just want to get a statement from you. You want coffee or something?" "No." "Water? Soda?" "Water would be nice." Jones continued fussing with the recorder. A female officer appeared in the doorway with my water. I glanced from her to the mirror. Two-way mirror? Who else was watching me? "I need a few things for my desk, okay?" Jones said. "Drink the water, relax, I'll be back in a minute." He left me alone in the room. I drank my water and waited, and waited. My breasts were starting to burn. I glanced at my watch. It was feeding time. I double-checked myself in the two-way mirror. Thankfully, my breasts hadn't leaked through my blouse. Otherwise, I'd have given whoever it was on the other end quite a show. At least half an hour passed before Jones returned, empty-handed. Empty-handed, but with McNerney by his side. He'd been buying time for McNerney to return. Both officers seated themselves across from me. Jones smiling, McNerney scowling. Jones leaned forward and said the date and time into the microphone. He mentioned all our names, then looked up at me. "Mrs. Connolly, can you tell us the last time you saw Michelle Avery?" "The day before yesterday." "Where was that?" Jones asked. "At her house. She'd invited me for lunch." "Tell us about it," Jones said. I shrugged. "She was very upset. She was drinking. She drank a bottle of wine while I was there." "Was that unusual for her?" Jones asked. "I don't know. I thought so. A whole bottle? But you're right. I hadn't seen her in a long time. I have no idea what her drinking habits were." McNerney cleared his throat. "So she was a drunk?" "I'm not saying that. I don't really know. I just know she was upset." Jones leaned in close to me. "So upset you think maybe she could have killed herself?" Before I could answer, McNerney said, "You got her suicide note in your purse or anything?" "What?" I practically yelled. The anger that bubbled up from inside me turned to tears. I plucked a tissue from the box on the table and wiped at my eyes. Jones bowed his head, giving me a moment to compose himself. McNerney simply watched me. I blew my nose and crumpled the tissue in my hand. The adrenaline from finding Michelle dead had left my system, and now all I felt was sadness, disbelief, and bone-deep weariness. I sighed. I really don't think she killed herself. Earlier you said Mrs. Avery thought whoever killed her husband might come after her, Jones said. Did she give you any indication, any at all, about who she thought that was? Take your time. I shook my head. You said you hadn't seen her in a long time, McNerney asked. When was the previous time? I hadn't seen her until... How much should I say? Surely the medical examiner had told McNerney I'd retrieved George's things. They waited for me to answer, exchanging looks. Finally, Jones prompted me gently. Until when? Monday, I said. I see. Jones made a note. There was a deafening silence in the room as they both consulted their respective notebooks. I licked my lips. I was parched again. Couldn't they get me more water? Where did you see her? McNerney asked. Didn't he already know the answer? I saw her at the medical examiner's office. Ah, yes. Mrs. Avery would have had to sign release papers, McNerney said. What were you doing there? If he didn't already know, he could find out. Why mess with me like this? I sat back in my chair, crossed my feet, and then uncrossed them. Honesty would be best. I fidgeted with my empty water cup, finally depositing the crumbled tissue inside it. I was picking up my brother-in-law's bags. Inspector McNerney flipped through his notebook. Ah, brother-in-law. Would that be George Connelly? Jim had been right. Nothing good would come from meddling in George's business. Yes, I mumbled. Interesting. Very interesting. Mrs. Avery said she didn't know George Connelly. He tapped his fingers on his notebook. Do you know why she would say that? I felt a protective surge for George, Jim's brother, Laurie's uncle. Not to mention I was getting tired of McNerney's attitude. What makes you think they knew each other? I challenged. Well, if he was your brother-in-law and you and she were friends... I went to high school with Michelle. Before Monday, we hadn't seen each other since... When was the last time I'd seen Michelle? I don't even remember when. Probably our reunion a few years back. It was a coincidence seeing her at the medical examiner's office. McNerney frowned. Was it? I nodded emphatically. Mm-hmm. McNerney sucked some air between his teeth, sort of tisking at my response. Now see, that's where I have a problem. The weariness in my bones was slowly turning to dread. Why not tell him everything I know? But then, what did I know, really? Michelle had said George was with her the night Brad died. Therefore, George couldn't have killed Brad. He couldn't have, right? Unless Michelle and George were in on it together. Or he killed Brad after leaving Michelle. Who killed Michelle? Dread was overcoming me. No, George is not a killer. I don't believe in coincidences, Mrs. Connelly, McNerney said. Of course, neither did I. Normally, anyway, but in this case I really, really wanted to believe. I blurted, Sometimes things happen for no reason at all. An accident, a fluke, chance. I had to release those bags to your family because I couldn't prove there was any connection to Mr. Avery. He was last seen on June 15th, and the medical examiner places his death in June. George Connelly's bags were found on September 19th, on the same pier where Mr. Avery was recovered. Months apart. Is there a connection? McNerney opened his hands toward me in question. Mrs. Avery tells me she doesn't know a George Connelly, so technically I can't prove a thing. But this, he patted his broad stomach, isn't technical. My gut says there is a connection between the Connellys and the Averys. I already told you. I went to high school with Michelle. He breathed some more air in through his teeth and grimaced. Something more recent. Something that involves your brother-in-law. I haven't seen George in a long time. When I see him, I'll ask him for you. One more thing, Mrs. Connelly. When your car was broken into yesterday, the location was curiously close to Il Paraiso, the restaurant owned by the Averys. Yep. What were you doing there exactly? What everyone else does at restaurants, eat. Kind of strange, isn't it? You don't see your friend for a long time, then all of a sudden you're frequenting her restaurant? McNerney asked. Is there a law against that? I'm just trying to understand why you were there. Were you meeting her there? Nope. Just eating. Alone. Well, with my daughter, actually, whom I've got to get home to. McNerney and Jones exchanged glances. Jones said, Thank you, Mrs. Connelly. We appreciate your time. If we need anything else, we'll contact you. I stood. Jones stood with me. McNerney remained seated, his arms folded across his chest. I made my way toward the door. I glanced over my shoulder. McNerney was still watching me. Let him watch. Where was the condolence? I'd found a friend dead, and he'd shown no sympathy. All he wanted to do was try and pin the murder on George, close the case, narrow his workload. And yet, the dread turned to nausea. Maybe McNerney was right. George had to be connected somehow. When I arrived home, Laurie was screaming in Mom's arms. She won't take the formula. I wrinkled my nose at the yellowish bottle Mom was putting in Laurie's face. I don't blame her. You used to love the stuff. Obviously, my daughter had a more discriminating palate. I collapsed onto the couch and nursed Laurie. I don't know who was more relieved, me at the burning sensation dissipating from my breasts, Laurie at being fed, or Mom at the peace and quiet. We sat in silence. I finished nursing Laurie, then rubbed her back, expecting a little burp. Instead, she threw up all over my silk blouse. I broke down crying. My bravado from facing Inspector McNerney evaporated. Mom took Laurie from me and placed her in the bassinet, then put her arms around me. Oh, honey, don't cry, she said, stroking my hair. It's just the hormones. I recounted my afternoon for Mom. She listened, her mouth agape. She rubbed my back. That's horrible. Just awful, honey. What a shock. I let her cluck over me, taking comfort in her support. My head was throbbing, my legs ached, and I had baby spit up all over my blouse. Not to mention finding Michelle dead and being interrogated by the police. Not a good day. I rose from the couch. I needed to change and take some pain medication at the very least. Will you come over tomorrow? I asked Mom. She hesitated. There's something I haven't told you as well. I sat back down on the couch and held my head. Had Mom's car been broken into too? Or worse, had someone tried to break into the house while I was gone? I'm seeing someone, Mom said. Mom? Dating? My parents had been divorced for nearly 15 years. Mother had said over and over again that she was through with men, that she lived only to have grandchildren. What? Who? I stuttered. A very nice man. His name is Hank. My body surged with a strange combination of happiness and, what? Fear? Jealousy? Was I going to have to share my babysitting mother? How selfish of me! I pushed the thought from my mind and hugged her. And why didn't you tell me this earlier? Mom shrugged sheepishly. I wasn't sure there was anything to tell. I smiled. How did you meet? Well, Mom said hesitantly, I put myself on Match.com. Mom, using the internet? What? I sputtered. Match.com, darling. It's a dating service online. I know what it is. I didn't know that you were... That's great, Mom. Really great. My profile was up for about a week. Mom made herself comfortable on the couch. I saw his profile. I already knew he worked at the pharmacy down the street, but that's all I knew about him. I didn't know if he was married or anything. When I saw him online, I thought, well, I'll be. He's single. So I winked at him. They have a little thing on the computer where you can wink at someone. It sends them an email from you. I sat there stunned. Jim and I had bought Mom a laptop for Christmas last year. Jim had shown her how to get online. I thought she used it to only read the newspaper. So I winked at Hank, Mom continued, and he winked at me. We emailed for a while, then we thought, well, this is just plain silly. We're both in the same neighborhood, so he invited me for a cocktail. I stared at her. Mom, you don't drink. Well, once in a while, there's nothing wrong with that, she said defensively. I laughed, realizing Mom was at it again, telling me a crazy story to take my mind off my problems. I'm not judging you, Mom. Tell me more. I would, but you look terrible, Kate. Exhausted. Not to mention I have spit up on my blouse. Let me go change. I'll be right back. Mom insisted on leaving so I could get some rest, but promised to fill me in on more Hank details later. Laurie and I were sprawled on the couch, looking at a farm animal picture book. Mostly I was looking at the book. Laurie was drooling. The cow says moo moo, I ad-libbed. I heard the key in the front door and scrambled to my feet. I pulled the door open and grabbed Jim around the neck, squeezing him, and inhaled his scent. Oh, honey, I'm so glad you're home safe. What's wrong? I found Michelle dead this morning. Oh, my God, why didn't you call me? I knew you had that big presentation today, and I didn't want to worry you. I recounted the experience for him. When I told him I went into Michelle's house, his eyes popped out of his skull as if he were on the verge of a heart attack. What if the killer had still been in there? I didn't think of that. She was lying on the floor. What if she wasn't dead? You should have waited for the police or the paramedics or whatever in your car with the motor running. He pulled me close. I'm glad you're all right, honey. Promise me you won't go around breaking into people's houses, especially if there could be a murderer hiding out. I didn't break in. The door was open. He clutched me tighter. And you can always call me, no matter what meeting I'm in. His voice cracked. I realized he was crying. Nothing's going to happen to me, I soothed, running my fingers through his hair. We need you, honey. Laurie and I need you. Except I might collapse from exhaustion and/or starvation. Jim smiled, his face brightening a bit. Want to call Il Paraiso? Get delivery? I asked. Jim squinted at me. Yeah, call. I'll open you some wine. I'm not supposed to drink. He rose. Exceptional circumstances call for exceptional measures. One glass won't hurt you or Laurie. He headed to the kitchen. My mouth began to water as I thought of a nice dinner and wine. Wine? Someone had drunk wine with Michelle. Her killer had been someone she knew, since there was no sign of forced entry. She let someone in, had wine with whoever it was, and then that person had let themselves out, leaving the door open for me. I pictured George going over to Michelle's and sipping Chardonnay with her. Wait a minute. George preferred beer, like Jim. He probably considered white wine a girly drink. Could a woman have killed Michelle? Brad's affair. The other woman. Why would Brad's lover kill Michelle? If Brad wasn't dead, then her motive would make sense, but with Brad gone, why kill Michelle? I called after Jim. Hey, Jim! Does George drink wine? Jim returned, a beer in one hand and a glass of Merlot in the other. I guess he does. White wine? Probably. I mean, I'm not sure it's his favorite, but I imagine he'd drink it. There went that theory. I dialed Il Paraiso. I'd like to order some food for delivery. The hostess promptly informed me that they didn't deliver. I looked up at Jim's expectant face. They don't deliver. I thought George was supposed to be the delivery guy. He sighed. What, did he quit already? Get fired? She said they've never delivered. Jim's face clouded, his mouth twisting with concern. Why would Michelle tell you he worked there if he didn't?